Thank you so much for that welcome. Thank you all for being here. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here. I've been making Australian archivist friends for about a decade, and it's really just great to see a lot of you in this room today. Today's talk is called Appraisal as a Political Strategy, Centering Our Values on the Oppressed. And before I get to the meat of it, I have a bunch of caveats, so bear with me here. So first, my analysis is based on my experiences as an American, specifically a white American woman, and that's a very specific cultural context. But while my specific experiences may be different from yours or foreign to you, the overarching argument still holds, I will contend. And I think we can have a really interesting conversation after my talk about what specifically is different and what specifically is similar in your context, right? But in any society, there are always power imbalances and inequities. And so that's really what I'm focused on here, even though I'm naming specific power imbalances and inequities from the US. I'm also going to be talking explicitly about feminism, and I'm not doing this to alienate the men in the room. I'm not a gender essentialist. Feminism is not just for women. Feminism is for everyone. So patriarchy hurts us all, just not equally. And a brief definitional note, when I talk about white supremacy, I don't only mean KKK members and self-professed neo-Nazis with burning crosses. That is definitely white supremacy. But I mean something more pervasive and insidious than that, using Frances Lee Ensley's definition that white supremacy is, quote, a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted, across a broad array of institutions and social settings, end quote. Finally, if you find yourself feeling alienated or defensive by my use of terms like feminism, patriarchy, white supremacy, whiteness, I ask that you reflect on why that is, but please do that internally in your own spaces and not here publicly during the Q&A. Okay, so now that I've gotten that out of the way, let's begin. So I'll begin by telling you a story about myself, the telling rooted in the feminist epistemology of valuing the knowledge gained through lived experience. The year is 1993. I'm a freshman at Columbia University in New York. This is a picture of Butler Library at Columbia University. For a few days every year, the university allows women to erect a temporary banner with women's names, not superseding, but on top of, higher than the male names that you will recognize etched in stone. So as a freshman at Columbia, it was very much an exceptional thing for me to be, given that neither of my parents graduated from high school, and I'm having a hard time adjusting to my new exceptional status. I'm used to not fitting in. I was one of the few white girls in my predominantly black public high school on the south side of Chicago, but this is different. My difference here is non-dominant and invisible, masked by the whiteness I share with the vast majority of my classmates and professors. No one has to know I'm different, even as I feel the difference acutely. I'm enrolled in the required Contemporary Civilizations course. Since 1919, all Columbia undergraduate students are required to take this course, which has set prescribed texts, consisting of the standard dominant Western canon. You begin the semester with Plato, you end it with Rousseau. There are no white women on the syllabus, and no people of color, and certainly no working-class white girls who went to predominantly black high schools. Needless to say, I'm having a hard time seeing myself in the readings. Glance through my copy of Plato's Republic or Hobbes's Leviathan from that time, and you'll find lots of marginalia of me writing racist and sexist. With each one of these assertions, I slide further off the text into an abyss of this is not for me, and I don't belong here. There is no hook to catch me. My professor, by all accounts a brilliant teacher, keeps writing on my critical reflection papers, what from this week's reading can we take with us? It's a question still in search of an answer. Most of my classmates have gone to private boarding schools. They've read these texts before, some in their original Greek and Latin, and they've come here to perform a certain kind of curiosity for 4 years before inheriting the earth. In the readings, they are looking to justify this inheritance, and they find it. I know lots of other stuff that my classmates don't know. I know how to babysit a dozen kids at a time, for which I got paid $1 an hour per child. I know how to stock shelves and bag groceries, for which I got paid minimum wage. I know how to make dinner for my family the nights my mom gets off work at 8. And I know all the lyrics to all the Cypress Hill songs. Cypress Hill is an American hip-hop group from the 90s. By 17, I've read nearly everything written by Toni Morrison, by Howard Zinn, and by Alice Walker, but none of that seems important in that classroom. 8 weeks into the semester, Machiavelli week, I stage an epistemic coup. Instead of turning in my weekly reflection paper, I write a paper about how I don't belong there. This is not my world. I don't even want this to be my world, I decry. It's the last gasp of a class traitor, revealing also in the ways that my whiteness cultivated the very possibility of belonging in the first place. The next week, the professor bought me a cup of coffee after class and told me that I should look into, quote, post-colonial studies. It's the first time I've heard the term. I rush to the library. I look it up. I start reading. I'm grateful to finally have a hook. I stop sliding. I say this not just to introduce myself to you, hi, but as a long way of saying who you are largely determines what you know. My classmates could not have known what I knew, and I could not have known what they knew. We came from different epistemological standpoints. We read the same texts in that class, but we read them differently. The problem is not the difference. The problem is that power legitimates some forms of knowledge over others. My classmates would not be forced to read the autobiography of Malcolm X, the same way I was forced to read Leviathan. Reading Leviathan was my price for participation, for which I was supposed to be grateful. My classmates had no price to pay. They were already golden. So golden that their inheritance, intellectual and capital, was unmarked, codified, and enforced. The core just floated there in the ether, unlocated in the racial capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy it existed to justify. Its alleged neutrality a convenient tool for those looking to mask their own complicity. There were no fingerprints on the core. This experience was repeated 15 years later when, as an MLIS student, I was introduced to the dominant Western canon of archival theory. This canon, written almost exclusively by white men working for government archives, did not speak to me. It spoke past me and against me. It did not situate itself. Its creators aimed to leave no fingerprints. It was just out there in the ether, masquerading as just what we needed to know to be archivists. So how is it that the dominant Western canon of appraisal literature in the 20th century ignores or devalues the standpoint of the archivist? How is it that, even in the past 20 years, when archival theorists have acknowledged the subjectivity of the archivist, their positionality is largely seen as something to document and mitigate rather than embrace? How is it that those most familiar with the practical intricacies of how knowledge is produced and canons are formed, who make the decisions about what gets thrown away and what gets preserved in perpetuity, have denied the mark left by their own fingerprints? It is because the canon of appraisal theory largely has been created by those at the top of the social hierarchy, who position their decisions as unmarked in service of power. They purport to be from nowhere, purport to serve no one but their employers, and purport to leave no fingerprints. We've lost much in the canonization of their ideas, foremost the value of the view from outside dominant power structures. So this talk aims to recuperate that which we have lost by applying feminist standpoint epistemology to appraisal theory. More specifically, I argue that feminist standpoint epistemologies help us rethink both the process by which archival value is determined and the archivist's role in that process, leading towards a new methodology, epistemology, and political strategy for appraisal, which I call feminist standpoint appraisal. Feminist standpoint appraisal inverts dominant appraisal hierarchies that value records created by those in power to justify and consolidate their power at the expense of records created by the oppressed to document and resist their oppression and imagine liberation. As such, feminist standpoint appraisal explicitly and unapologetically gives epistemological weight, thereby assigning value to records potentially activated in service to those individuals and communities oppressed by capitalism, white supremacy, and heteropatriarchy. Furthermore, feminist standpoint appraisal shifts our thinking about the position of the archivist from a purportedly objective, quote, view from nowhere, which in fact belies a dominant but unnamed white male position, towards a socially located, culturally situated agent who centers ways of being and knowing from the margins. In valuing the unique insights gleaned by people on the margins, feminist standpoint appraisal refuses the notion that archivists from oppressed communities must overcome their positionalities to meet institutional goals and professional demands for neutrality, but rather values and leverages the insights gained from outsider status, viewing the attendant insights as an asset rather than a detriment to the archival endeavor. Furthermore, feminist standpoint appraisal calls on archivists who inhabit dominant identities to acknowledge their oppressor standpoints and actively work to dismantle them. So throughout, I take inspiration from Hope Olson's naming and subversion of dominant identities as universals in library and information studies. Olson writes, quote, "The white, ethnically European, bourgeois, Christian, heterosexual, able-bodied male, WEBCHAM presence is labeled the mainstream, and hence the universal from which all else is deviation. The WEBCHAM mainstream is not viewed as a special interest, while the diverse others are. In a sense, universality/diversity is the ideal of patriarchal reason," end quote. I will use Olson's concise and necessarily specific WEBCHAM label to reveal the ways in which WEBCHAM perspectives have masqueraded as unnamed universals in methodologies for determining archival value. By exposing the unnamed universals in archival appraisal, I aim to undermine their truth claims and provide a different basis on which to claim knowledge. So first, what is feminist standpoint epistemology? I'll define feminist standpoint epistemologies as ways of knowing that acknowledge, in the words of Patricia Hill Collins, that's impossible to separate the structure and thematic content of thought from the historical and material conditions shaped by the lives of its producers, end quote, and that center the perspectives and needs of oppressed communities in the pursuit of knowledge. As such, feminist standpoint epistemologies accomplish two goals. First, they situate the previously unnamed WEBCHAM position as such, revealing how the alleged universality of view from nowhere positions is a charade. And secondly, they give epistemological priority to positions emerging from and aligned with oppressed communities. Feminist standpoint epistemology observes that knowledge produced and cultivated by oppressed people gets dismissed, devalued, and in some cases labeled false by dominant power structures. More specifically, in contemporary societies, knowledge is created by people of color, white women, indigenous people, working class people, disabled people, and queer and trans people have been derided, such that they are either not recognized as valuable forms of knowledge or dismissed as patently false. These subjugated knowledges, in the words of Sandra Harding, are often seen as roadblocks members of non-dominant communities must overcome, or vestiges we must lose to conform to and succeed in the academy and in the archives. Feminist standpoint epistemology seeks to recuperate these non-dominant forms of knowledge by not only stressing their intellectual legitimacy, but affirming that holding such marginalized epistemologies is in fact intellectually advantageous. That is, members of marginalized communities see things differently than those who occupy dominant positions, and those differences in perspective strengthen and enrich the creation of knowledge, leading to better questions, better ways of doing research, and better scholarship. In this case, better means in better service of those communities who have been oppressed in the first place. In a reversal of dominant hierarchies, feminist standpoint epistemology claims that those who occupy privileged positions are less likely to produce work that interrogates the status quo. Sandra Harding writes, quote, "Knowledge claims are always socially situated, and the failure by dominant groups critically and systematically to interrogate their advantaged social situation and the effect of such advantages on their beliefs leaves their social situation a scientifically and epistemologically disadvantaged one for generating knowledge," end quote. Nancy Harstock, seeking to unmask and name the privileged positions masquerading as neutral, asserts, quote, "In systems of domination, the vision available to the rulers will always be both partial and perverse," end quote. The ultimate aim of standpoint epistemologies, in Harding's view, is, quote, "to produce knowledge that can be for marginalized people, rather than for the use only of dominant groups in their projects of administering and managing the lives of marginalized people." Furthermore, and of particular interest to archivists, feminist standpoint epistemology unmasks neutrality for the masculinist and white supremacist positions it obfuscates. Harding writes, quote, "The more value neutral a conceptual framework appears, the more likely it is to advance the hegemonous interests of dominant groups, and the less likely it is to be able to detect important actualities of social relations. For Donna Haraway, such claims to neutrality render dominant epistemological paradigms unlocatable and irresponsible, meaning unable to be called into account. For those who inhabit oppressed positionalities, feminist standpoint epistemologies empower us to view those perspectives that have been constructed as barriers to success in the archives as indeed great blessings. For those of us who inhabit oppressor positionalities, feminist standpoint epistemologies can give us the tools to name and dismantle the oppression that has shepherded us in the first place. Our dominant notions of archival appraisal map consistently onto the dominant Western white supremacist narrative I got in my undergraduate core curriculum. The intellectual history of appraisal insists that archivists take allegedly universalist view from nowhere positions. These positions remain remarkably consistent in the past century of appraisal thinking, despite seismic conceptual shifts in our field. So here, in situating universalist claims in dominant power structures, I'm building on the foundational work of Anthony Dunbar and Mario H. Ramirez in the US context in applying critical race theory to archival studies. I also take seriously Burgess Jewell's observation that in the name of neutrality, we're erasing people, communities, and their humanity from the historic record. I take that as a given, and I ask, how did we get here? Our tour of the archivist view from nowhere begins with Hilary Jenkinson, a name familiar to many of you, in the UK Public Records Office, who famously rejects appraisal as an archivist's duty, and along with it, the personal commitments, priorities, and ideals of the archivist. Jenkinson writes, "Anyone who is to take upon himself the responsibility of destroying irrevocably archives which have come down to us from the past should do so on something more than a consideration of his own interests and of those of the time in which he lives. The archivist's career is one of service, his aim to provide without prejudice or afterthought for all who wish to know the means of knowledge. The good archivist is perhaps the most selfless devotee of truth the modern world produces," end quote. Jenkinson conceals that his alleged view from nowhere is actually the view from a large government bureaucracy, attending to an increasingly vocal working class and women's movement at home, and active resistance to imperialism in colonies across the world. To be in service to the work of others in this context is to be complicit in colonialism and its attendant racial capitalism and patriarchy. Thus, reading Jenkinson from a feminist standpoint epistemology that is starting from the perspectives of the colonized abroad and the oppressed in the metropole, we see that Jenkinson's moral defense of truth evades responsibility for archival complicity in deeply troubling systems of domination. By contrast, T.R. Schellenberg from the National Archives of the US advocated that archivists take an active role in appraisal, proposing the now foundational concepts of informational and evidential value and tests of uniqueness, form, and importance. His methodology assumes the archivist is positioned solely in service of its employer, namely that of a government agency. Appraisal decisions, Schellenberg writes, quote, "should not be based on intuition or arbitrary suppositions of value. They should be based instead on thorough analyses of the documentation bearing on the matter to which the record pertains." In this framework, that which posits the archivist as a unique person with an identity occupying a space in a community and society is seen as a bias to be overcome with sound research skills. Here, we see the shift from archivists being in service to the truth, with a capital T, to archivists being in service to the government or their employers. Starting in the 1970s, archival theorists in the Western tradition shifted the intellectual authority for appraisal from the institution to the society. Terry Cook's macro-appraisal approach, for example, focuses on appraising bureaucratic functions rather than the records themselves. In this approach, archivists conduct research and make appraisal decisions based on the functions fulfilled by records creators. Like its predecessors, macro-appraisal assumes that, quote, societal values should be the basis of archival appraisal. For Cook, the surest evidence of these societal values is their interaction between government agencies and citizens. By investigating the function of those government agencies, archivists can determine which functions best reflect the value of citizens and are thereby worthy of retention. Acknowledging appraisal, quote, is inevitably a subjective process, Cook advocates that archivists, quote, keep full and transparent documentation of their contextual research, appraisal process, keep destroyed decisions, and resulting transfers of records, and should create and implement benchmark standards against which the appraisal process itself can be judged, end quote. In this way, sound research and methodology can temper personal agenda. Yet Cook's approach assumes a fully functioning democratic government that fully reflects the values of its citizenry, an assumption increasingly out of step in the US context, I'll add. This assumption reflects a position of dominance. In contrast, feminist standpoint epistemologies legitimate the views from outside the system. Outsiders know to mistrust the intentions of the government and its ability to accurately represent the will of the people. From the perspective afforded by feminist standpoint epistemology, invocations of society are a totalizing, universalizing, colonizing tendency. Society is never only one thing, and when it's constructed in the singular, it always already leaves out minoritized communities. In this way, macro appraisal replicates the view from nowhere thinking. The late 1990s bore witness to the latest bursts of appraisal theory, as archivists struggle to make sense of dominant positivist formulations in the wake of postmodernism and deconstructionism. Many of these postmodernist and deconstructionist contributions to appraisal theory do acknowledge the active role the archivist takes in creating value via appraisal decisions. However, in most of this literature, the archivist's personal perspective is still seen as an obstacle to overcome rather than a standpoint to be leveraged. Karen Trace accurately summarizes postmodernist and deconstructionist views of appraisal by stating, quote, any grand narrative and any unifying theory of appraisal are impossible because worth and value are subjective notions. Adding, in this situation, the best that archivists can do is to be transparent and open about the ideas and the processes that shape their appraisal decisions. Again, a political position or identity is seen as something that must be acknowledged and overcome, rather than an epistemologically valid viewpoint to be leveraged. Yet just when we might give up on appraisal theory in a fit of despair or slide off without a hook, we reach the work of Vern Harris, who I know spoke at ASA 2 years ago. Harris embraces the positionality of the appraising archivist in creating value out of inherently distorted slivers. He demonstrates, quote, no observer, no writer is exterior to the object of his or her observation. Hallelujah. His work offers a powerful critique of the field's historic claims to objectivity. He writes, and I quote at length here, archivists assume that they can remain exterior to the processes that they are seeking to document. That, of course, is not possible. They participate in those processes. They are complicit in the recording of process. The appraiser's values, quality of work, perspectives, interaction with the creators and owners of records, engagement with the policy he or she is implementing, and so on, all become markings in the appraisal and determine what becomes the archival record. The appraiser is co-creator of the archival records. For appraisers, the ultimate objective is to preserve records with archival value. But what constitutes archival value is, and will always be, specific to place, time, culture, and individual subjectivity. It does not dangle somewhere outside of humanity, immutable, pristine, transcendent. So here we finally see a hook on which we can hang standpoint epistemologies. Yet Harris also tempers the idea of giving individual creativity full rein in the appraisal process, stating that archivists must also be held accountable to policies and programs, an accountability that can be evidenced by, quote, the appraiser demonstrating critical self-awareness, disclosing assumptions, and maybe even attaching a biographical sketch in the case files. A feminist standpoint epistemology would ask in return, accountable to whom? And explicitly value accountability to those most marginalized, rather than employers, institutions, or a vague notion of society. More recently, archival theorists, myself included, have shifted the focus of appraisal from reflecting society's values to those of the community. The invocation of community in the US and the UK usually signifies a community of color, but often such significations remain coded, implicit, and ill-defined. Writing in 2007, Schulten and Srinivasan propose a community-based participatory form of appraisal. Although participatory appraisal can potentially revolutionize archives by shifting power to oppressed communities, it too can elide the position of the archivist. In the attempt to get as close as possible to the community, we have obscured the positionality of the archivist in relation to that community, and I know my early work is guilty of that. As this brief tour of the past century of the dominant canon of appraisal theory demonstrates, archival thinking has suffered from an allegedly universalist view from nowhere thinking that has in fact masked WEBCHAM identities, positionalities, and agendas. Over the past century, archivists have shifted the grounds on which they've claimed archival value, from the truth to the government to society to the community. Yet alighting the standpoint of the archivist remains remarkably consistent. It's in this intellectual genealogy that feminist standpoint appraisal intervenes. Feminist standpoint appraisal provides the grounds on which to determine the value of records. Here, as in all archival appraisal epistemologies, the general epistemological question of how do we know what we know is refined in the context of appraisal, so that we may ask, how do we know the value of records? Feminist standpoint appraisal then asks, what does the view from those who are most vulnerable suggest about what to collect and from whom? It then answers this question by stating that the highest value of records lies in their ability to serve the needs of oppressed people. Rather than promulgate a universalist notion of bringing balance to the historic record or diversifying it as an afterthought, feminist standpoint appraisal begins with the view from the margins in the determination of value. It acknowledges all knowledge is partial and attempts to diminish the perversity of that partiality by serving those most in need. Feminist standpoint appraisal posits that mainstream archives employing dominant appraisal methodologies have resulted in archival collections that overrepresent dominant groups. In this way, feminist standpoint appraisal presents a corrective to this overrepresentation of WEBCHAM identities and priorities in archives. Feminist standpoint appraisal explicitly names a shift in allegiances from dominant institutions and structures to people and communities most oppressed by those dominant institutions and structures. It calls for an inversion of hierarchy in which we can, in the words of Jarrett Drake, who I know also spoke at ASA 2 years ago, learn the most from the least. To be clear, records created by people in power can serve the needs of oppressed communities, and in fact are crucial for legal, cultural, and political efforts for justice and reparation. However, what makes a feminist standpoint appraisal different from dominant forms of appraisal that also value the records of people in power is the explicit aim and orientation of feminist standpoint appraisal to serve the needs of the oppressed rather than those from dominant groups, or as in most appraisal epistemologies, to no one in particular. Indeed, in most appraisal literature, you're not supposed to consider use or users at all. I'm not arguing that we altogether stop collecting records created by people in power. I'm arguing that we do so with the needs of the oppressed in mind. Thus, for example, while a functional analysis or macro appraisal approach and feminist standpoint appraisal might yield the same results, that is, identify the same records as being worthy of value, the aim is explicitly different. Furthermore, feminist standpoint appraisal explicitly values the vantage points of archivists from oppressed positions. Taking a cue from Patricia Hill Collins' writings about Black women researchers in the academy, Feminist standpoint appraisal asks that managers, institutions, policies, and structures do not ask archivists from oppressed communities to submerge their own personal and cultural biographies, but rather to trust them, quote, as significant sources of knowledge that are named and exalted in the appraisal process. It also acknowledges the way that archivists from oppressed communities have been silenced, punished, and erased when they've tried to leverage this knowledge in professional settings, and seeks to repair and correct those structural inequities. Here, the danger of being oneself fully in a professional context are not equitably distributed, as women of color theorists have noted. In the archives world, Chaitra Pal, Holly Smith, Shanae Moraine, and Skyla Hearn have described how predominantly white institutions appropriate the expertise and positionality of Black women archivists when it benefits the institution, often to the detriment of Black women themselves. They write, quote, "We feel affirmed in showing up as our authentic selves with our diverse identities and seeing that as an asset to our profession, not a liability." Rather than shift the responsibility on archivists from oppressed communities to change their labor practices, feminist standpoint appraisal shifts the responsibility to employers, institutions, and structures to welcome and reward their critical perspectives. This approach thus enables archivists from oppressed communities to leverage the knowledge gained by their positionalities to value records created by and potentially activated in service to those made most vulnerable. For archivists from dominant groups, feminist standpoint appraisal offers an opportunity to align archival practice with oppressed communities by both acknowledging and dismantling oppressor standpoints and attempting to center oppressed standpoints. Such an alignment takes time and work. It will be a journey, not a destination. Archivists will not get a certificate from a professional association acknowledging their adoption of an oppressed standpoint that they can frame and hang in their offices. For those of us who do inhabit vectors of privilege, feminist standpoint appraisal should be less about claiming an oppressed standpoint and more about owning up to our oppressor standpoints. It will entail naming and dismantling the oppression that creates our privilege in the first place. Feminist standpoint appraisal acknowledges that part of the reason why archival collections are such distorted overrepresentations of WEBCHAM identities has been what Jarrett Drake rightfully calls the unbearable whiteness of the field. This is echoed by Burgess Jewell's claim in reference to digital archives. Quote, "Who gets represented is closely tied to who writes the software, who builds the tools, who produces the technical standards, and who provides the funding or other resources for that work." It's also echoed in Tanya Sutherland's pointed question, what does it mean for someone who holds Blackness as otherness to make decisions about creating, maintaining, using, and sharing records about Black Americans? It has meant archival collections and appraisal strategies that further alienate rather than liberate. Feminist standpoint appraisal demands nuance, and here's where I try to ward off your critiques in advance. Of course, inhabiting a marginalized identity does not necessarily make one's work liberatory. People who are oppressed in some contexts certainly may be oppressors in other contexts. Identity is never easy or stable. We must be cautious about valorizing or romanticizing oppression. We must also be careful not to collapse important differences, cultural, historical, social, and political, into a generic umbrella of oppressed. Furthermore, people who inhabit dominant identities may align themselves with, learn from, and act in support of people who are oppressed, but they should not appropriate their knowledges. Feminist standpoint appraisal eschews essentialism, even as it remains wary of easy claims to allyship. We cannot let feminist standpoint epistemology be used as an excuse to further promulgate the whiteness of the profession by claiming that white people who seek to adopt marginalized positions are just as good as, or can adopt the perspective of, archivists of color. Rather than bolster the credentials of white people, feminist standpoint appraisal should instead help to dismantle the white supremacist theories and structures that keep people of color and other minoritized groups from becoming archivists in the first place and remaining in the profession once here. Furthermore, the proposed approach to appraisal does not seek to reify simplistic or essentialist binaries, but rather calls attention to power dynamics in a necessarily nuanced and context-dependent fashion. We can talk more about how to put this into practice, how to enact feminist standpoint appraisal in your own jobs as archivists. I have ideas, but ultimately it's up to you, the practitioners. And I want to be clear here that there are already several archival projects, both organized by independent community archives and community-minded university archives, already employing what I would call a feminist standpoint approach to appraisal, as evidenced by the ways in which they center the perspectives and experiences of archivists, activists, and artists from oppressed communities. Forgive me that these examples are all American because that's the context I know best. Examples include Documenting the Now, Project Stand, People's Archive of Police Violence in Cleveland, the Texas After Violence Project, and the South Asian American Digital Archive. Not surprisingly, archivists of color started and sustained these projects, seeing gaps in the historic record that their white colleagues either did not see or did not work to fill. The proposed feminist standpoint appraisal is a plea for the profession to value the vantage point that warranted these projects, reward the labor involved in them, and inspire more like them. And to be clear, by reward and value, I mean financially, materially, and professionally. Feminist standpoint appraisal is also explicitly a political strategy in that its ultimate aim is the use of records and archives for the liberation of oppressed people. Accurate representation in archives and the emotion it engenders, what I've termed elsewhere as representational belonging in the face of symbolic annihilation, is a key step along the way to liberation, but it's not an end goal in and of itself. Feminist standpoint appraisal does not start and stop with more representative archives, but explicitly asks about the liberatory uses of such collections. Liberatory uses of records may take the forms of historical evidence to establish fact, legal evidence in claims for justice, land reclamation, or material reparation, or cultural evidence to imagine futures unbound by the oppressions of the present. In summary, I've proposed a new appraisal theory, methodology, and political strategy by bringing into conversation two disparate strands: archival theories of value and feminist standpoint epistemologies. In so doing, I hope to revive vigorous debate on archival appraisal that has remained dormant for too long. The stakes are too high to let my students and colleagues from oppressed communities inherit a tradition that does not acknowledge their own epistemic value, one that in fact asks them to sublimate who they are to do the work of an archivist. I do not want these students and colleagues to have an "I don't belong here, and this is not for me" response, similar to the one I had sliding off Columbia's core curriculum so long ago. I want them to get hooked. Feminist standpoint epistemology has the potential to transform archival appraisal and help liberate a profession whose theories and practices have done far too much damage to oppressed communities. We're faced with a choice, archivists. Are we going to continue to reproduce the unmarked, partial, and perverse worldviews of those in power in our classrooms, our writings, and in our archives? Or will we have the courage to name how capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy, and heteropatriarchy have permeated our field, then locate and shift our relationship to them? Will we have the conviction to align archives to center the most oppressed communities? Can we build a new canon of archival theory, one that both acknowledges and dismantles oppressor standpoints and centers the standpoints of the oppressed? Who gets hooked and who slides off? It's up to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I think that these it's so critical to have these viewpoints come to us and to think and reflect on at an individual level. Sometimes we go, well, what can I do? And sometimes it's about just engaging with the systems that we have, the people that we employ. It's not all, we don't always have to make major changes in what we do in every day, but it's definitely worth to think about, so thank you. Now, we've got time for some questions. So hands up, we've got 2 roving mics that are around. And Jenny at the front, your hand's up nice and straight, thank you.
Thank you. Hi, thank you.
Is that working?
Yes.
That's working, yes. Thank you so much. As a white, transgender, lesbian archivist, that spoke to me hugely.
I'm glad.
I suppose my question, my request for comment is, from my experience of working with community, let me think. It's given that most of the major archival institutions are born of colonial and repressive regimes, my experience is that many marginalised communities don't trust them, don't trust white archivists, and so are left to conserve and preserve their own records with the inherent lack of resources that are afforded to mainstream organisations. So how would you propose, or how would you discuss the idea of mainstream archival organisations collecting, appraising, providing access to the records of oppressed groups, when we have the fear that by giving our records to those institutions, they may be served in future to oppress us further?
Right. Such a good question. Thank you so much for it. It really sort of gets at the heart of the issue, right? Because I think, at least in the American context, there's this huge pressure now on archivists to diversify their collections. And what they've done is then gone out and replicate colonial extractive mentalities, where then they go into those communities that they have not valued, that their universities or government agencies that they work for have in fact been oppressing and extracting from those communities for the past century, and then extract those materials and bring them back to the university repository, where they're essentially not accessible to members of those communities, and then subject to all kinds of intervention, like processing and description, that further imposes this dominant structure onto those materials. I've done a lot of work with community-based archives in the US, and the primary thing that unites community-based archives is a lack of funding, right? They are struggling financially because they are so chronically under-resourced and underfunded by mainstream funding institutions, whether those are private foundations or government grants. It's starting to change a little bit. But many of them are volunteer operated, many of them have leaky roofs, many of them can't digitize anything, they have no infrastructure to do that. I think one possible solution is a post-custodial approach, right, where university-based archivists work in conjunction with those community archives, not ripping custody away from those materials from those communities, but working more collaboratively to provide broader access if that's what the community wants. I think the most important thing that archivists working for dominant institutions can do to community archives is respect their autonomy. So that's the first thing, respect their autonomy. Realize that 100 years or 200 years of extraction is not going to change overnight, right? And that archivists are seen as representatives from the university that has been extracting from those communities for so long. So it's going to take time, and it's going to be rough, right? Nothing about working with community is ever easy, right? It's going to be rough. And I think in some ways it feels like the work is impossible, because the structures of power are so strong and have been around for so long. And I tell my students, it's impossible, but do it anyway, right? Because the resisting is in and of itself liberatory. That feeling of saying, I'm not going to do this anymore, right? The buck stops here. That is a liberatory feeling in and of itself, but still keep fighting even if it's impossible. But yeah, it's going to take a lot of time and energy and a lot of listening and relationship building. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. It was amazing.
Thank you.
I'm Adelaide. I'm from the University of, Monash University today, actually. I just wanted to reflect on the fact that as a white archivist, I have the privilege of choosing on which days to put my thinking hat away and kind of just go with a policy or something like that. whereas members from an oppressed community don't have that option. They every day feel the responsibility from their community to make decisions that supports that community, and that's something that we need to be better as a profession at recognising, and just recognising that risk of burnout among archivists from oppressed community groups, and just the fact that we have that incredible privilege every day to go to work and not go home exhausted because we don't feel necessarily that responsibility. So thank you very much for your talk. It's great.
Yeah. No, that is a really important point, the level of burnout and exhaustion and emotional weight that archivists from oppressed communities experience on a daily basis, and that those of us who are white, who are from oppressor communities, we can forget about it at the end of the day. Or we might have one day where we feel particularly stressed out because of racial tension, and then we turn on the TV or walk down the street and white supremacy is still the structure that is shepherding us, right? And I think we need, it's one of the many reasons why we need more archivists of color, right? So that there's not such a major burden on the few archivists of color that are in our field. But we also need, I think, a full frontal assault on white supremacy in terms of our foundational concepts and practices. It's not just a matter of who is a part of our MLIS programs or who becomes archivists. All that is important. But if people of color come to MLIS programs and are learning only white supremacist values and concepts, that's not going to go very far, right? And so I think we need to do some really critical, deep, structural work on all levels.
So if you could join me again in thanking Michelle Caswell for her fascinating and challenging talk.